about the concept of polycentricism and why it's relevant to both SAON and to the roads process. So when we talk about polycentric systems, many centers, to say it more simply, what we recognize is that we are, as I speak of SAON trying to unite many actors, we know that some of these actors are concerned and living in the Arctic and working on issues at the local level, be they tribes, co-management structures, municipalities, and many structures for observations are located, as somebody once said, all observations are local, right? At the next level, and some of these levels, there's not always clear distinctions between them, but at the regional level, we have, from the standpoint of Indigenous peoples, they have their own regional organizations, sometimes regional nonprofits. There's also academic programs that are working very often at the scale of the regional level, state and provincial governments, of course, and then this is where we begin to see the emergence of observing networks. And then at the global scale, we know that many of the things that are driving Arctic observing are being driven by international agreements, policy accords at the international level. At the global level, we see Indigenous peoples' permanent participant organizations. We also see, and this is one of those things where is it regional, is it global, it's Pan-Arctic, Arctic Council efforts. And then this is also where the global observing networks are interacting. And what's important for SAON in thinking about how we unite these many centers is recognizing itself as a polycentric actor, which means we don't have direct authorities over our partners. We can't tell them what to do, but we can facilitate and lead and help identify areas of common interest where we can move things forward. So I'll give a quick example. We heard from Alice earlier that one of the conversations here today is going to be related to wildfires. And so if you took a sort of polycentric lens about who's doing what related to wildfires in the Arctic, you'd see, and then I also want to point out the short statement. I'm going to have a couple short statements dotted through these remarks that you can take notes on if you want to get more information. But this one by Sylvestre et al. Concerning a new initiative on Arctic wildfires and the roads process. At the local level, we can see that we're going to need to be thinking about local fire managers. We're going to be needing to think about community preparedness plans, what kind of in situ observations can be made, sometimes community-based observations in terms of early warning systems. At the regional level, there's a lot of activity with wildfires right now. We certainly also have regional fire management bodies, but there's issues related to broader co-management bodies that we want to think about. There's things happening at the Arctic Council level. And then in the academic setting, we have things like the Alaska Fire Science Consortium, the Arctic Passion Project. And in our observing networks, we're looking at things like the NEON network, the long-term ecological observing networks, and some of the regionally focused campaigns that inform these efforts. And then globally, what's driving concerns globally about wildfires in the Arctic? You can read from the list some of those issues. And again, I include Arctic Council because of the Pan-Arctic nature here. And so this concept of polycentricism shows that for any given context, any given problem that we're trying to address, there's sort of this differing organizations that get tied into these conversations and are concerned with these conversations. And in the roads process, what we'd like to see is a real deliberation around who needs to be at the table as we're moving different conversations forward, and how we can identify the value proposition for these organizations and find alignment in those values so that we can make progress. Another short statement I wanted to draw your attention to by Bradley and Barsegli, I'm going to mispronounce the name because I can't read it that well, Barsegli, is a really nice paper on network analysis. And social network analyses can really help support these kinds of identifying these webs of polycentric actors and figuring out how they're currently connected, where the gaps are, and how things can be improved to get the right voices to the table. So as I mentioned at the beginning, the roads process has been was initiated or kind of conceived of before the last Arctic Observing Summit. Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks impaneled a task force and asked it to make recommendations about what should be included in its roadmap, how it should proceed. And so the next few slides I'm going to show are some of those recommendations that came out of the task force, but they were also brought into the Arctic Observing Summit in Iceland, where there was a lot of dialogue about these planning principles, and they were greatly enhanced through that dialogue. And that's certainly something that we're hoping to see at this meeting, is to take these planning principles even a step further, as we can see is already going to happen. And I hope that if the word polycentric got lost on you the first time around, I'll just try and reinforce how it shows up in our guiding principles. So the first guiding principle really has more to do with equity building, which is also key. We're not going to be able to align many centers if we don't do so equitably, and in particular, proceeding in equitable arrangements with Indigenous peoples and the organizations that really cross scales from the standpoint of polycentricism. We also noted in the planning process that every aspect of the roads process needs to support broadly shared benefit. So the roads process is not going to try to replicate or duplicate things that are being done elsewhere if broadly shared benefits are already showing up. We're going to act in the places where we feel that benefit can be expanded. Which brings to the next bullet is that, again, this is not meant to be a planning process of replication. It's really meant to be a planning process of integration and enhancement. Where can we do better so that we can extend the reach of global observing networks into the Arctic, or extend the benefit of already occurring local level activities into areas of broader concern? So we really want the roads process to be sort of a light operator at sort of a meta level. And last, we recognize that many organizations are really ready to go on their plans. Some of the things that we're going to be talking about during the summit are those efforts or organizations that have some real drive behind them right now. While we do want the roads process to create more of a holistic view across the many centers of action that SAON's concerned with, we realize that this is going to be a process that takes time. And so we wanted to design a process that would support stepwise development. So talking about how we think about and use societal benefit concepts, societal benefit frameworks to support what we're trying to achieve with Arctic observing, I'm going to start on one of the first forays that SAON made into this type of planning space. And one of the mechanisms that we see as being important to help us understand what the activities are and where the gaps are. And this is an analysis system we call value tree analysis. And so what we try to achieve with value tree analysis is to recognize that on the one hand, we have the infrastructures of our current observing systems and our desired observing systems, be they satellite systems, local observer networks, in situ systems, airborne, et cetera. And on the other side, we have what we're trying to achieve with our observing systems. And in this particular framework, we refer to these as societal benefit areas. These are sort of big bucket areas. I'm showing 3 areas that SAON's been working with weather and climate and ecosystem processes and food security. This is just a sample of a broader set. And what we know is that the space in between is often referred to as the valley of death. How are we getting from our observing networks into societal benefit, and what are the pathways through which we're adding value and making sure we're supporting public services? So in value tree analysis, we do a really explicit mapping where we look at how the observing systems are already feeding forward into the kinds of intermediate products that we need to do the decision making and problem solving. But the next step is, how do these intermediate products feed forward into the applications that really have a public face? Public services are feeding into everything from the immediate scale that Corey was speaking to, where people are needing to make decisions in the moment, up to the climate scale, et cetera. And it is ultimately these applications that are supporting the societal benefits that we're concerned with. And so trying to support these rigorous assessments is part of the roads process. It's the first step in the roads process. We don't need people to do it exactly like this. This is a system that's worked well. I want to point out a couple other short statements and efforts that I think are really relevant to the conversation of how we conduct value tree analysis. One is a short statement by Bill Manley and others about developing an improved registry of our observing systems themselves so that we have a sort of ready list to choose from as we're understanding which observing assets are supporting which data products. And then with the data products, of course, Working Group 3 and its efforts on the federated search of relevant Arctic data products is really also going to have some relevant things to add into this conversation. A point again on achieving equity in the roads process and returning to what Seon first started creating in this space of trying to understand that if we plan in support of shared benefit, if we plan in support of societal benefit, we're probably going to achieve more of the outcomes that we desire than if we plan simply from the standpoint of research questions, which can have a more limited aperture and don't always directly address societal benefit. So in light of that, in 2017, SAON and its partners developed the International Arctic Observing Assessment Framework, which was a key document that moved this conversation forward. It identified 12 societal benefit areas and broke them down into finer resolution of the key objectives of what we think an observing network should be able to achieve. At the last Arctic Observing Summit in the Food Security Working Group, one of the really important conversations and pieces of feedback to SAON that came out of that was the recognition that Indigenous peoples, communities, and organizations have already put considerable effort into thinking about observing in support of societal benefit for Arctic communities. One great example is the Inuit Circumpolar Council, Alaska's food security framework, and it is how we understand the relationships between different kinds of benefit frameworks that I think is really going to help us in this kind of non-hierarchical polycentric arrangement where we're all trying to improve our observing networks. And so one of the papers, and I know this is really small, it's a paper by Sterling et al., and I'd be happy to share the reference with anybody, but they looked at a similar problem in the South Pacific where local and Indigenous people had their own concepts of what benefits looked like for their societies, for their livelihoods, for their food security, water security, energy security, which are represented more by the red figures, which are going to be on the left. And they were looking in those blue boxes at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and recognizing that these different concepts were incommensurable. But it didn't mean that through ongoing dialogue, they couldn't understand how they could be linked and how through linking concepts at different scales and from different interest groups, you can begin to converge on planning tools that really help you move the process forward. So again, pointing to some of the pieces that are happening at the summit, in a joint conversation between Working Group 1 and Working Group 5, we're gonna, one of the discussions is gonna be some updated recommendations about how we could proceed in this space to better link different kinds of benefit frameworks so that we're not only using a single vantage point on benefit inside the roads process. So another tool that was conceived of by the Road Mapping Task Force, but greatly enhanced through dialogue at the last Arctic Observing Summit. In fact, the name even changed as a result of the last Arctic Observing Summit, is the concept of shared Arctic variables. And so shared Arctic variables cue off of one of the planning tools used by the global networks, where they take the greater system into consideration and parse it into smaller phenomenological pieces like sea ice, like benthic abundance, like permafrost, different kinds of indicators. And around these topics, more focused communities of practice can form to develop improved requirements, to harmonize practices, and to share implementation strategies across many different actors. And so the task force found many strengths in the essential variables of the global networks, but also recognized that these were very often focused on climate scale phenomena, large scale phenomena, driven by satellite assets, and were often not well integrated with some of the activities that were happening across other scales, and also not necessarily reflecting this principle of shared benefit in the region. And so the shared Arctic variable concept, what comes together is a recognition that, again, returning to this principle that Indigenous communities are already doing a lot of observing, community-led, community-driven observing in support of benefit for their own outcomes in their communities. These activities and interests need to be brought into a view that's shared by what's happening at the regional level, regionally identified issues, Arctic Council level issues, science program issues. Many of the academics in this room operate observing systems at this scale. And then considering then where these intersect with the essential variables of the global networks. So the global networks are a very valuable tool, but how can they be extended, or how can their requirements be extended, and how can there be greater participation and implementation across these different scales to support the outcomes that we're all interested in? And so this intersection of these kind of major constituencies is what gave rise to the concept of a shared Arctic variable, where we can see variables developed in support of cross-sectoral use, again, recognizing that we're not trying to recreate every variable of the global systems, but just identify those where there can really be some important enhancements, and maybe identify variables that are unique to the Arctic that are not already represented in the global systems. And so Alice Bradley et al. Wrote a really nice paper kind of elaborating on this concept, adding more detail, more definition as a result of the dialogue from the last Arctic Observing Summit. There's also a great short statement by Laverne and Kern concerning the concept of stewardship. And I really encourage everybody participating in Working Group 4 to take a close look at this paper, because there's a lot of great recommendations about lessons learned from the global essential variables and how it might impact how SAON proceeds. So how do these tools work together? So in benefit assessment, we get to do an assessment of what we have, how it's currently linked together, understand where the gaps are, what societal benefit areas are not being well attended to by our current activities. And then by using shared Arctic variables sort of in concert with a value tree assessment type of view, we add a layer of coordination. This is where our communities of practice show up. So how's this all going to proceed? Time will tell, because we're right at the threshold since the last Arctic Observing Summit of getting some pilot projects lined up behind the process to begin driving it forward. So I'll share some of the concepts of what that's going to look like. So I've mentioned some of the steps that the task force felt would be important in the process of developing the roads process. And the first was doing some kind of assessment to understand what the most important categories are that fit into this shared space where we can really enhance what's already being done. The second step is to move into a requirements kind of view, where we try to better understand, based on the benefits we're trying to achieve, what that starts breaking down into in terms of the observing system that we're going to need to execute on that, and also to look at issues like harmonization, data sharing, interoperability. And in the third step, this is when we start really engaging, I mean, not hopefully at the third step, but throughout, with the people who are going to be supporting these efforts, be they funding organizations, regional organizations, community organizations. And then and so what I'm going to do is give you sort of a forward-looking vision with a little sample of what we envision the forward motion to look like, which is executed through expert panels. So we understand that some expert panels might be regional in nature. I have to move quickly, according to Alice, looking at a cluster of variables and slowly progressing them throughout the process. We understand that some, and I should say this is typical of the kinds of things we're hearing from the Food Security Working Group, and also something that's being piloted out of the United States under a research networking activity. The other kind of participation we expect is thematic expert panels, such as we will see under the Arctic Passion program, which has recently been funded to lead efforts under the process as well. Again, a forward-looking vision, this one related to sea ice, and another more issue-driven, getting back to the example of our wildfires. And there's 3 short statements related to from the Arctic Passion project related to how this is going to move forward. So just, I got a chance to already talk about the capacity building working group. I think this is one of the other places in the meeting where we're going to have some really great conversations about equity, how we work together across different knowledge systems, how we work together across different assessments of benefits and values. So I encourage you to participate in at least one of those discussions. And then this is really a summary, which I'm calling my reading guide to the AOS. So some of those short statements lined up under some of the planning principles of the roads process. And I'm happy to make this available because I know I'm at time. I'd like to thank the co-authors of the roads process who are listed off to the side. And then the publication that summarizes many of these points is listed here as well. So thanks for your time.
Thank you. Questions, or is it time? It's time. All right. If the magic room in the back could pull up our next speaker on Zoom, I would like to introduce Michael Mann, who is the Special Envoy for Arctic Matters and has been since April 1st, 2020. So prior to that, he was the EU's ambassador to Iceland between 2011 and 2017. He was the head of strategic communications at the European External Action Service, doubling up as the chief spokesperson to the High Representative and Vice President Catherine Ashton from 2011 to 2014. So Mr. Mann worked as a European Commission spokesperson from 2002 to 2011, covering a wide range of portfolios. He began his career in Brussels as a journalist, working for the Financial Times, Reuters, Bloomberg News, among other media. So today he'll be talking to us about the role of the EU space programs in Arctic observing. Thank you.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me okay. Are you hearing me well?
We can.
Super, great. In which case I'll carry on. Thanks very much indeed for asking me to speak to you this morning. I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, prior engagements in Brussels, but I guess the only positive thing to emerge from the pandemic was the fact that we can now communicate better with each other through the wonders of electronics. So I'm here with you now. I wanted to start with just a few words about the current political situation, actually, if you don't mind. I mean, as we all know, we have this unacceptable situation with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that has caused great disturbance to all sorts of international cooperation, not least in the Arctic. But the message that we really want to put across is that Arctic cooperation, excluding Russia, really does need to continue. I mean, this is very important. There's so much important work going on. The business that you're discussing at this morning's session, for example, has to carry on for the benefit of the Arctic, for the benefit of the people who live there. So our message is that we are looking for ways to continue cooperation, and it's fantastic to see your conference over these days showing that willingness and that determination to continue cooperation. Having said that, as you may be aware, last October, the EU published its updated Arctic policy. It's by far the most ambitious Arctic policy document we have ever produced. It not only describes the myriad of EU activities in the Arctic regions, but also seeks to define the role the EU wishes to play in the geopolitics of the Arctic. Crucially, and really for the first time, it sets out a number of key actions and targets the EU is committed to achieving over the coming years. And EU space programs will play a key role in many of these policy aims. I will focus, as you kindly said this morning, mainly on the role of space programs in our Arctic engagement. And this commitment has a long history. In fact, the EU has been playing an important role in Arctic observation for many years. The EU space systems Copernicus and Galileo already help us to monitor and better understand climate change and to support safety and mobility in Arctic regions. As we set out in our updated Arctic policy, we will continue investing to enhance our space capabilities going forward. And these improved capabilities will benefit the Arctic both directly through improved connectivity and indirectly through better monitoring of the impact of climate change on the broader Arctic environment. When we think of science and technology and the Arctic, we must underline the importance of space and space research and what we know space technologies can deliver in a region that is so devoid of ground infrastructure. The EU clearly understands the role that space technologies have to play in the Arctic. I refer here back to the European Union's space strategy of 2016 and the regulatory framework facilitating EU funding for the next 7 years up to 2027, which acknowledge the importance of the Arctic regions for the EU. Let's not forget that EU space systems are already operational and are global in reach. Indeed, Copernicus is the world's largest Earth observation data provider. Our space systems already play a pivotal role for the Arctic in helping us to understand climate change, in supporting transport safety and mobility in general. In particular, the current Copernicus polar activities serve the EU's political priorities in terms of climate action, maritime surveillance, exploitation of marine resources, energy, and the blue economy at large, biodiversity conservation, and cultural heritage. And the list is in fact even longer than that. Planned enhanced Earth observation capabilities are also crucial for understanding the impact of climate change in the Arctic Ocean, in Antarctica, and in Greenland. I'd like to look for a moment at the future. As shipping through the northern passages increases, there will be an increased need to continuously monitor moving sea ice and icebergs via Copernicus, and from there to safely help ships navigate away from danger using Galileo. At the same time, there will be a continuous need to inform ships about safe routings via secure communication channels. The EU is currently looking to develop a multi-orbital satellite system which will deliver global service broadband capability. In all, this system will greatly improve connectivity in the Arctic, which is lacking in many regions. So as you can see, we are developing our space systems with the user in mind. We're looking at the various ways communities and businesses in the Arctic can use our space services, and we're taking action accordingly. Our space technologies are also well positioned to support broader EU political priorities, some of which are extremely relevant for the Arctic. We have, for example, the European Green Deal, which is the #1 priority of the current European Commission. It's our concerted push for a more sustainable future. We are investing in new Earth observation missions relevant to the Arctic. These missions will help the global scientific community to better understand the environmental impacts of climate change in the Arctic, notably the impact on the cryosphere. Dedicated missions will provide vastly improved measurements of greenhouse gas emissions such as CO2 and methane. Over the last few years, with the objective of supporting the European Space Agency in their technical activities to design the future missions, the European Commission has carried out various initiatives to collect user requirements and to translate them into Earth observation needs for services and data for the polar regions. The Copernicus Polar Expert Group's work in particular, has made an important contribution to the Copernicus program. The findings in the PEG's report are timely and well elaborated based on useful intelligence gathered from the Copernicus services as well as external scientists. This has not only ensured that the requirements of the user communities in the Arctic are understood, it's also laid the groundwork for defining an operational Copernicus polar observing system that's best suited to support the implementations of the EU's Arctic policy overall, as well as the fight against climate change. Importantly, it places the EU and the European space sector at the very heart of this fight. Through the comprehensive work of the PEG, the Commission is well aware of the risk for potential gaps in our Arctic data coverage and the impact that such gaps would have on the quality and continuity of Copernicus services and products. Together with ESA, the Commission will continue its efforts to improve the Earth observation capabilities in the Arctic in response to the observation requirements of Copernicus services users and research users. Aside from the vital role of technology, I also want to underline that one of the key aims of our new Arctic policy is to put people first. We need to provide the infrastructure that will allow the creation of future-orientated jobs and allow communities, not least indigenous groups, to continue their lifestyles and maintain their livelihoods. For the first time, our policy explicitly backs the concept of free, prior, and informed consent before decisions are taken with a potential effect on indigenous communities. But this is not just about helping local communities, because they themselves can also provide us with vital input as we take on the fight against climate change and its many negative effects. Earth observation from space is crucial, but so is the input of communities directly affected by the changes they live with day by day. That's why a number of projects and programs under, for example, Horizon Europe and its predecessor will directly call upon indigenous knowledge from the initial stages and will rely upon observations on the ground. The Horizon 2020 project Arctic Passion, which I believe is heavily involved in the organization of today's event, is a perfect example of this. It seeks to establish an all-inclusive observation system that can record ongoing environmental changes in the Arctic. It does this through observing the climate, the cryosphere, and ecosystems using data obtained from satellites. This provides a good overview as it covers large areas, but it also collects data on the ground and from platforms at sea to make more detailed observations. Finally, it'll use the important knowledge that indigenous peoples have collected for many decades to detect changes in the environment. I see that time is relatively short. I think I'll finish here, and I'd be very happy to take any questions that you might have. And I hope in this brief intervention, I've succeeded in setting out the role of the EU in Arctic observation. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much. We do have some time for questions, and there's one of our fantastic volunteers in an orange shirt with a microphone. Up front row.
So thank you. I'm Toste Tanua from Geomar in Kiel, representing the Global Ocean Observing System. I have a question for Sandy. Sandy, thank you very much for an excellent presentation. And very interesting to see how you refer to the polycentric framework. And that is something that we've been thinking a lot of in GOOS, in the global system, how a polycentric multi-level framework is good for governance. And as Elinor Åström, who devised this concept many years ago, pointed out, one of the important part of moving the system to be perfectly polycentric is an efficient mechanism of learning and sharing. So I wonder if you can expand a little bit on what SAON and SAON-ROADS process is on enhancing learning and sharing towards a polycentric system.
Is this mic still working? Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, so the work by Åström et al. Has really been hugely impactful. And I think knowing that some of the applications for polycentricism have been used to tackle challenges as extreme as educational systems, Western water management systems, and coral reef systems is encouraging. It encouraged me that maybe the Arctic is no less tractable than those. And I do appreciate that this concept of joint learning has to be at the beginning. And I think so the Arctic Observing Summit, I think, is a great kind of example of how the roads process as simply a SAON tool alone would not be as effective as sort of a shared tool between the Observing Summit, where we can do a lot of the conversations and learning. But I also think that from previous summits, one of the things that was identified around tools like benefit frameworks and different kinds of value tree assessments is they serve as a kind of a knowledge map where you can better understand not just who's doing what, but why they're doing it. And so there's no substitute for dialogue in these exercises, but having tools that people can explore where they can understand how things are connected, the kinds of network analyses that Alice led are also really helpful in this respect. So I think it's a great point, and let's hear more about how we can improve that within the process.
Thanks. We have a question from Hayo. I think there's a mic right in front of you.
Sorry. A question for Hayo Aiken, University of Alaska Fairbanks. Question for Michael Mann. That was a great overview of EU priorities with regards to space programs. Can you say a bit more about what you see as the most effective mechanism to have direct links between Arctic observing and science programs and EU policy? Do you see the current approach as being fast enough to address some of these rapid changes that we're seeing both in the environment and the geopolitical framework?
Thanks for the question. It's a very big one. I think the system, if I understand it correctly, works relatively well at the moment. But I think we're fortunate in being in the stage of the establishment of new projects and programs now. So I think we're able to learn perhaps from the experience of our last 7-year cycles. So I think perhaps there are lessons that have been learned and can be learned. I mean, I remember listening to colleagues from DG RTD describing how they very much wanted to enhance the participation of indigenous groups in developing science and observing and research programs from the early stages of their development rather than bringing them in later in the day as they have been in the past. So I think it does work well from my perspective. I think lessons have been learnt. I think the establishment of some of the New Horizon projects bear in mind very much the need to sort of make a closer link between the sort of rather theoretical science and the application of that science in terms of innovation on the ground or the involvement of sort of human observers, if you like, on the ground. So I think that things are moving in the right direction. The problem that we have, I mean, I don't want to bore everyone, but I mean, the problem that we have at the moment is that we do have this terrible situation where the whole basis of Arctic cooperation, which has been extremely good and cooperative, and every Arctic country has had common interest in the Arctic, that has been completely thrown into doubt at the moment through the unjustified actions of Russia. So we have to find ways of making sure that this cooperation continues in a very effective way, whilst justifiably excluding Russia from it. And that's my main message, as I said at the beginning of my discussion of my talk today, that we need to talk much more between the 7 Arctic states, not including Russia, and our other people as well, ourselves as the European Union. Our Arctic involvement isn't just through the Arctic Council or whatever, it's actually through our own programs. So we need to find ways of continuing the work and deepening the work whilst keeping Russia at arm's length. So that will be a challenge, I think, geopolitically speaking. I hope that sort of answers the question.
So we have time for one more, and I'm going to abuse my power of having a microphone in my pocket to ask it. So I have another question for you, Michael. What do you see as the role of events like the Arctic Observing Summit and international bodies like SAON in kind of providing feedback into EU level, both policies and science priorities? Or I guess in other words, what can we do to help you?
Well, that's the 64 million euro question, and they're vital events. I mean, as I mentioned euros there. We are, I mean, I myself, I am playing very much a coordinating role. As you heard from my presentation, I'm rather a generalist here, but I do a lot of public presentations about the EU's work in the Arctic, and it's absolutely vital for me. I mean, some of my colleagues from the various commission departments in JRC, RTD, DEFIS, whoever it may be, they are extremely expert on their specific areas of interest. I am not. So from my personal perspective as the sort of public face, if you like, of the EU's Arctic policy and the main PR man on this, events like yours just bring me into contact with concrete examples. I'm terribly good at talking about principles and theories, but to actually see the work that's going on the ground, the real concrete work allows me to actually give some sort of meat to the bones of what I'm talking about. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there actually, because it's only through coming to events like this that I really do talk to people who know. And we need to bring together the different strands of policy because the EU does do a remarkable amount of work in the Arctic, but I don't think a lot of people know about it. And it's only through bringing really concrete examples as presented this morning that I can do that effectively. I have to move personally from the theoretical to the very practical. And your events, we just need to keep the lines of communication open. Bombard me with information. If a concrete project brings a concrete result, I really need to know about it, and my colleagues need to know about it, because the EU is quite a large and diverse operation, and so we don't always talk very well to each other. We need to communicate and pass on all the amazing work that is happening. So good luck with your event. It's really inspiring, to be honest.
Thank you. I guess we do have one last question, and we have a whole minute and a half before the coffee shows up. So from the top.
Thank you. Paul Berkman, United Nations Institute for Training and Research in Harvard Law School. You're advocating shutting doors with Russia because of Ukraine, and we have a condemned problem with Ukraine, no question about it, reprehensible. But are we ignoring the future at the expense of the present? Throughout the Cold War, there was extensive effort to build bridges with the Soviet Union to facilitate dialogues, even though we had two superpower adversaries. Are we at risk of compromising the integrity of the entire global academic system by seeking to isolate and exclude dialogue among allies as well as adversaries? It would seem that the policy of shutting these doors is extremely short-sighted. The types of problems that we face as a globally interconnected civilization require thinking short-term to long-term. And it seems that the process that we're embarking on to close these doors now is at risk of compromising the ability to operate over long-term. And if we think in terms of time scales of climate, these are decades to centuries. And so I just wonder whether advocating shutting doors among allies and adversaries for geopolitical reasons, whatever they may be, is short-sighted, particularly in the context of the academic community.
Well, yeah, thanks very much for your point, which is a valid one, of course. But let me be very clear. What Russia has done is beyond unacceptable. And we have to take every measure we can to isolate Russia in the hopes that they can see sense and stop an indiscriminate attack on a sovereign country and bombing to hell tens of thousands of innocent civilians. However, having said that, what we are doing from our perspective is cutting off contact with Russian state bodies, with oligarchs linked to the government, with the regime, but we're not shutting the door entirely to academic interaction. And we have in Brussels, for example, in the European Union, a kind of clearinghouse system where if somebody from our science departments wants to continue contact with an academic or a scientist who happens to be Russian or happens to work for a Russian institute, they get a judgment from this clearinghouse whether or not that work can go ahead. So of course we don't want to, and that's the point I want to make, we don't want to undermine the vital work that's going on to save Arctic regions from the ravages of climate change. And we want to continue to help Arctic communities to have a viable future. But at the same time, we cannot compromise on the very tough line that we need to take against Putin and his cronies. So there is a balancing act to be performed, and we're hopefully performing it in the right way with your guidance.
Would it be accurate to say that during this period of pause, that people-to-people interactions is acceptable, whereas institution-to-institution interactions are during a period of pause?
In broad terms, that would be accurate, yes. But obviously, we deal with things on a case-by-case basis.
All right. Well, I would like to thank both of our speakers this morning. Sorry we don't have coffee and cookies for you via Zoom, but I'll
help myself here, so no worries.
Thank you all for joining us this morning. We do have a half-hour coffee break